everyone. Today, our group is going to do the presentation about the Philippines. First of all, let's begin with the question, where is the Philippines? The Philippines, or officially the Republic of the Philippines, is a country in the Southeast Asia, which situated in the western of the Pacific Ocean, consisted about 7,641 islands that are broadly categorized under their main regions, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. The capital city of the Philippines is Manila. It is Philippines' second most populous city. Moreover, it is highly urbanized and as of 2019 was the world's most densely populated city proper. Before the 90th wave of the colonization, the Philippines was colonized by the Spanish from 1565 to 1898. However, the Spanish colonial period ended with the Philippine Revolution in 1898, which marked the beginning of the American colony era of the Philippine history. there came the time of American colonial era. Starting from 1898 to 1946, it started on April 21. In 1898, the U.S. declared against Spanish. It was the first time overseas conflict fought by the U.S., which involved major campaigns in both Cuba and the result happened in the form of the Treaty of Paris, which the Spanish agreed to give up the islands of the Philippines. The Treaty of Paris was signed on December 10, 1898,
but there were only two
stated to give the independence
First,
to Cuba
America's support
and
ongoing struggle by Cubans and Filipinos against Spanish rule, and the second, the mysterious explosion of the battleship of USS Maine and Havana Harbor.
The treaty, together with the end of Spanish imperialism, made the United States position was a world power. During the American colonization, here were some advantages of the local people of the Philippines. The Filipinos were receiving first of all is the religious freedom. When the United States took over the Philippines, people began to be free to join whatever religion they wanted, which contrasts with the previous law like Spain. They established the Catholic Church as a national religion and strongly enforced local people. Second is free education. The United States sent the teachers to help establish schools so that the Filipino students could access the free education. A large group of these teachers were called the colonized. Taught in the schools and was the language that teachers used. Even today, there is the Tanglish, which is a combination of Tagalog and English, and has become the part of their culture. Also, English language is now Philippines' second national language. Moreover, the Filipinos received the American influence in clothing and food. Then, there came a big turning point when the chronic problems from the previous rule of Spain still remained, as a matter of the fact that the Filipinos has been fighting a bloody revolution against Spanish during 1896 and had no intention of becoming colony of another imperialist power. In February 1899, fighting broke out between the occupying American army and the Filipino forces. Let's watch the video together.
Fathers do when Thomas Jefferson stated that he was waiting for the fall of the Spanish Empire until our population can be sufficiently advanced to gain it from them piece by piece. When Mexico successfully gained its independence, it wasn't long before the U.S. found the American Southwest in its hands after a war with the new country. Nearly 50 years later, after the U.S. successfully defeated Spain in 1898, Jefferson's prophecy would once again come into play. One of the results of the Spanish-American War was that several Spanish colonies fell into American hands. Two of these were Cuba and the Philippines. And while the U.S. made it clear that it wouldn't keep Cuba, the story of the Philippines was a bit different. Hi everyone, Thought Monkey here, and today I'll be talking about the Philippine-American War. The Philippines is a nation made up of many islands. During the age of exploration in the 16th century, the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan arrived on the islands and claimed them for Spain. Over the next 400 years, the Filipino people were subjugated to the rule of Spain, which had some ups and a lot of downs. Even before the US went to war with Spain and took possession of the Philippines, Filipino revolutionaries had already been struggling for independence with a big, bad Spanish Empire. And while at first many of them believed that the Americans were coming to liberate them from Spanish rule, it was clear that when they didn't allow the general of the revolutionary forces, Emilio Aguinaldo, and his troops to march to Manila alongside American troops, that the US had other ideas in mind. In October of 1898, a conference was held to determine the fate of the Philippines. The Americans were given three choices: to hand the islands back to Spain, to give the Philippines its independence, or to annex the territory. While many anti-imperialist Americans were against annexation and quoted President Lincoln when he said, "No man is good enough to govern another man without the other's consent," the fact is that those in power held a different view of the Philippines. President William McKinley believed that it was God's will for Americans to uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and believed that they were unfit for self-government. And finally, he believed that it would leave a power vacuum of which Germany or other rival countries may be quick to fill. On February 6, 1899, the treaty to annex went before the US and passed by one vote. The Philippines now belonged to the Americans. While the treaty was passed in the US, the Filipino revolutionaries were not quite happy with the idea. Fighting quickly erupted, and by June 2, 1899, the First Philippine Republic officially declared war against the United States. The war lasted 3 years, and the US found victory. The Philippines were devastated by the war as it caused a breakdown in its infrastructure, causing hunger, disease, and displacement. Ultimately, an estimated 34,000 to 220,000 Filipinos were either injured or killed. The Roman Catholic Church was de-established as a state church, and English became the primary language among the government, business, and education. While the official war was over, fighting between different revolutionary groups in the Philippines and American forces continued for more than 10 years. The issue was not necessarily that the US wasn't going to grant the Filipinos independence, but more about when and under what conditions. In July of 1902, the Philippine Organic Act stated that upon peace, a legislative government would be created containing a lower house which would be popularly elected by Filipinos, and an upper house which would be appointed by the President of the United States. At home in the US, the public tended to consider the annexation of the Philippines as expensive and something that brought little profit. Moreover, Teddy Roosevelt said as early as 1901 that he wanted the Philippines to be able to self-govern, and by 1907 he said that he was ready to figure out a way to give the islands their independence. By 1916, the Jones Act was passed promising the eventual independence of the islands and created an elected Philippine Senate. And in the 1919 presidential election, Woodrow Wilson stated that his intention was to deprive ourselves of that frontier, the Philippines. In 1934, another act was signed promising Filipino independence in 10 years, but because of World War II, there was a 2-year delay, and the United States finally granted the Philippines independence in 1946. The question remains, however, did the US do the right thing when it annexed the Philippines over 100 years ago? If the Philippines hadn't been annexed, would they have been colonized by another global player?
Next, we're going to talk about the people that were important leaders during that time. This guy's name is Jose Rizal. He was a Filipino nationalist and a polymath during the tail of the ends of the Spanish colonial period of the Philippines. He was tagged as a national hero by most of the Filipino, and he was also became a writer and a key member of the Filipino propaganda movement, which advocated political reform for many colonial under the Spanish. Next is Andres Bonifacio. He was also considered as one of the greatest heroes of the Philippines, and he was also recommended and also honored officially by the National Heroes Committee. He was also the author of very famous novels in the Philippines and also other poems and essays. Next, we're going to talk about the situation of the World War I. The Philippines was dragged to the World War I, or the Great War, and it was known before 1939, simply because the United States joined the war in 1917. What most people may not know is how the Philippines participated in the World War I, though it is not as active as it would be during the World War II. Since the Philippines was an American territory, it is obliged to help her so-called Uncle Sam. If America's contribution in the war is small, the Philippine contribution is logically smaller. Still, it disproves the idea that only Vietnam, a French colony at that time, and Siam, now Thailand, which what even provided pilots for Allied planes, had any significant contribution in the European theater, the main theater of at First World War from the Southeast Asian nations. The Philippines actually funded and built for the United States one destroyer. USS Herschel is the first and the only American warship named after the Filipino, Jose Rizal. While the Philippines did not have a chance to build its first submarine, America did not need many submarines at that time. At least it is in the Pacific, since submarine warfare was there and its infancy in the most submarine action happened in the Atlantic. One more thing, the Philippines did for the American during the Great War was drafting of Filipinos in the U.S. National Army. The colonial government had a quota to 15,000, the Philippines provided 25,000. This became known as the Philippine National Guard or the PNG. However, the PNG never saw action. And also, the Filipinos who did not set the foot in Europe during the war were enlisted in the American Expeditionary Force or the AEF. The most famous Filipino soldiers were Thomas Mateo Claudio. He died in June 1918. He was the first Filipino casualty of the war, followed by around 50 more Filipino deaths until the First World War ended in the same year. The Philippines also captured for its allies 22 German merchant ships, of which 7 were later used by the Filipinos' internal sea trade, and the rest of it was given to America goodwill presents. Thus, it proves that the Philippines was also the part of the so-called Great War or the World War I.
The Philippines' involvement in World War I. Prior to the war, the Philippines was recently annexed by the United States in the 1898 Treaty of Paris, following Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War, which happened that same year. But when Europe plunged into war in 1914, the United States declared its neutrality, as Americans at the time believed that going to war in Europe is unnecessary and wanted to stick to its isolation policy. However, their opinions changed when in May 7, 1915, a German U-boat submarine sailing off the coast of Ireland torpedoed the RMS Lusitania, killing 1,198 people on board, including 128 Americans, and was followed by the sinking of the SS Arabic on the 7th of August, which cost the lives of 3 Americans, seeding the first cracks between America and Germany. But that crack eventually broke on January of 1917 when British intelligence intercepted and exposed a German telegram secretly delivered by Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmerman to the Mexican government. The letter persuades Mexico to attack the US if the country ended up at war with the German Empire. This angers the US government, eventually declaring war against Deutschland on the 6th of April. So, okay, what was the Philippines doing during this so-called Great War? Despite people getting killed in battle, we were an American colony at the time. So, once the US entered the war, the US Congress issued the colonial government in Manila to draft 15,000 Filipinos to be integrated to the US Army. But the colony was able to assemble 25,000 men and form the Philippine National Guard. Now, the colony also contributed to one naval ship, that is the USS Rizal, named after our national hero Dr. Jose Rizal, making the ship as the first and only time that an American ship was named after a Filipino hero. And originally, there were also plans on constructing submarines. This is the first time in the history of the US Navy, but was canned by Congress and the Filipino public. Reason for this is they were not needed at the time, especially most of the submarine warfare only situated around the Atlantic Ocean. And if the US government approved the project, it would take a long time for the submarines to get there. But all of the US demands from the Philippines didn't sought action due to the war was ended in 1918. However, some Filipinos have managed to participate the chaos of trench warfare and saw the bloodshed of no man's land in Europe out. The first one are the 4,000 Filipino contract workers in Hawaii that work on pineapple and sugar plantations were drafted into the Hawaiian Infantry Guard, while others working from the agricultural areas in California and other states volunteered or drafted as soldiers, cooks, musicians, engineers, vehicle repairers, and medical workers on the battlefield and the American Red Cross. Another from that article is Julio J. Enereta, who served as a minesweeper in the USS Aider. But what's interesting about this man is because he enlisted in the Navy on February of 1919, 3 months after the armistice was signed back in November 11, 1918. But because of his job is to remove sea mines that were left out after the war, he was still considered as a World War I veteran in 1921. Not only he served in the First World War, but he also fought in the Second World War as well, making him the last surviving Filipino to fight both world wars. Another thing the Philippines contributed to the war is they confiscated 22 German merchant ships from Philippine ports. 7 of them were used as trading ships by the locals and the rest was taken by America as a gift. While the crews of these ships were sent to an internment camp in Baguio, they provided resources from sectors of the mineral and agriculture industries. In support of the Allied forces, they also bought liberty loans to compensate the relatives of Filipino troops fighting in Europe's war, while Germans and Austrians in the island were put under monitored surveillance for a possible collaboration with the Central Powers. I saved the last for the most famous Filipino who fought in the Great War, and that is Tomas Mateo Claudio, who became the first Filipino casualty in the war. His involvement into the conflict started in November 2nd, 1917, when he enlisted himself into the Army's 41st Division.
Next, we're going to talk about the World War II. Japan launched a surprise attack on the Philippines on December 1941, just 10 hours after the attack of Pearl Harbor. The defending Philippines and the United States troops was under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who had been recalled to active duty in the United States Army earlier in the year and was designated commander of the United States Armed Forces in the Asia-Pacific region. The aircraft of his command was destroyed, and the naval forces were ordered to leave because the circumstance of the Pacific region reinforcement and the resupply of his ground forces were impossible. Under the pressure of the superior numbers, the defending forces withdrew the Bataan Peninsula to the islands of Corregidor at the entrance of Manila Bay. Manila, declared an open city to prevent the destruction, was occupied by Japanese on January 2, 1942. The Philippine defense continued until the final surrender of United States Philippine forces on the Bataan Peninsula in April 1942 and on the Corregidor in May. Most of the 80,000 prisoners of the war captured by the Japanese at Bataan were forced to undertake the infamous Death March to a prison camp 105 kilometers to the north. It is estimated that as many 10,000 men, weakened by disease and malnutrition and treated harshly by their captors, died before reaching their destination. This man, MacArthur, was ordered to Australia, where he started to plan for the return of the Philippines. The Japanese military authorities immediately began organizing a new government structure in the Philippines. Although the Japanese had promised independence for the islands after occupation, they initially organized a council of the state through which they directed civil affairs until October 1943, when they declared Philippines an independent republic. Most of the Philippine elite, with few notable exceptions, served under the Japanese. Philippine collaboration in Japanese response political institutions, which later became a major domestic political issue, was motivated by several considerations. Among them was the effort to protect people from the harshness of Japanese rule.
The United States was suspicious of the Hucks and their leftist sympathies in that they had fought against the landowning class during the war, since they had collaborated with the Japanese. The Hucks were ordered to disarm in the face of persecution by American troops, as well as the Filipino constabulary and local landlords. Any villagers who displayed sympathies for the Hucks were harassed, and many had food supplies and houses burnt down or were even arrested. One notorious incident involved the Huck group, Squadron 77, who in February of 1945 were surrounded by American and Filipino soldiers and then shot and killed. Their bodies were then buried in a mass grave. Arrests of prominent Hukbalahap leaders then followed, including the two top leaders, Castro Alejandrino and Luis Taruc. By September of 1945, however, they had been released, and Taruc formally announced the end of the Huck resistance, asking for recognition of Huck veterans in exchange. Now, keep in mind that while negotiations began between the Huck and MacArthur and Filipino President Osmeña, the fighting continued. Osmeña agreed to recognize some of the Huck fighters as veterans, but not all of them. This resulted in the total rejection of the government's proposal by the Huck, and a refusal to lay down arms. Across the country, landowners who were under increasing pressure agreed to increase the share of each harvest that peasants were allowed to keep to 60%. This was a promise, however, that just wasn't kept, forcing the Huck to re-enter the political arena. They formed the National Peasants' Union, the PKM, which advocated for a 60% share of harvest for peasants, equality for all Filipinos, protection for peasants, and even low interest rates in loans to those peasants. All sounds a little leftist, doesn't it? Well, the continued persecution of the Hucks actually did push the PKM movement to the left and into an alliance with the communists. In the summer of 1945, the PKM, together with the Communist Party, formed the Committee of Labor Organizations, the CLO. This alliance, the Democratic Alliance, or DA, actually supported President Sergio Osmeña in the elections that year, as he was still seen as a more favorable option to the staunchly conservative and anti-Huck opponent Manuel Rojas. Despite the support of the DA, Rojas was elected president. Further to this, the 6 seats in parliament that the DA did win were annulled, and the Huck representatives, including Luis Taruc, were barred from taking their seats.
The whole of the UP campus was taken over by the Japanese. And every morning, the Japanese would take out their garbage around 10 o'clock. There would be a crowd waiting for the garbage to come out because food was so difficult during the war. Food was so difficult. People are waiting there to salvage whatever food they can get from the garbage. This is garbage. And suddenly I saw a Japanese, short, stocky. What I can't forget is that he wore a white belt with 3 buckles in it. And he had a wooden sword, the one that they use in their kendo games. This is a solid piece of wooden sword. And he began hitting and hitting and hitting one of the men who was there trying to grab whatever food was in the garbage can. This took place for about 10 minutes until that man fell on the ground and died. He was dead. That's the atrocity I cannot forget. He was a man starving to death, fighting for his life for garbage, and here comes this Japanese with his solid wooden sword and begins to hit him until he died.
The Vietnam War. The Philippines provided effective support to the United States and its allies in South Vietnam. Initially with the Philippines contingent, and later Philippine Civil Action Group Vietnam.
Mabuhay or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo. Now April 30th, 2015 marked the 48th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. Known to many in the Southeast Asian refugee communities as the Black April, or for the many people in Vietnam as the Day of Liberation. It was a critical and controversial day in history. It marked the official end to the Vietnam War. Now speaking from a Filipino and historian's perspective, here are 5 things about the Philippines and the Vietnam War that you probably did not know about. Number 1. The Philippine-American War and Genocide of 1899 to 1903, or in some cases up to 1913, is considered by many historians as the First Vietnam, in recognition of the many similarities and intersectionalities between the two conflicts. The Philippine-American War set a precedent of US involvement, intervention, and interest in the affairs of the region, of the Southeast Asian region. Number 2. As fellow Southeast Asians, the people of the Philippines have traditionally been sensitive to the humanitarian needs of the people of Vietnam. As early as 1954, the Philippines sent humanitarian missions to Vietnam. Contingents of agricultural workers, doctors, nurses, and nutritionists were sent to provide care for the people not just of Vietnam but also of Laos during the war. Number 3. Between 1964 to 1971, the Philippine government sent non-combatant troops to serve the medical, dental, engineering, and other needs of the Vietnamese people. To this day, many Filipino doctors, nurses, teachers, rights activists, humanitarian workers, and many more are found in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. It is a part of this collective regional consciousness and movements to strengthen the bond between the people of Southeast Asia. Number 4. When Saigon and South Vietnam fell in 1975, the Philippines immediately built communities to shelter and aid the refugees. The Philippines was one of the earliest countries to open its borders and welcome the refugees with open arms. Which is why, when the world's strongest typhoon, Haiyan, hit the Philippines in 2013, many from the Vietnamese American communities rallied together to raise aid and send aid to the people of the Philippines. And they said that it was done in gratitude and in recognition of the love the people of the Philippines extended during the war. And number 5. More importantly, for us Filipinos and Filipino Americans, we cannot deny the profound effects of the Vietnam War to the people of the Philippines themselves. From a critical and decolonized perspective, the Vietnam War was used as an excuse to continue the United States' involvement and infringement of Philippine sovereignty. The Vietnam War was also used as a bargaining chip to keep the Marcos dictatorship in power. It was a dark chapter in Philippine history. And if you think about it, many of the problems and issues plaguing the people of the Philippines today could be traced back to both the Marcos dictatorship and the continuing neo-colonial relationship between the United States and the Philippines. Now hopefully this would help broaden the understanding of the Southeast Asian history and identity. The people of Southeast Asia in all 11 countries, both mainland and the islands, have long shared a collective consciousness and regional identity and intersectionalities for thousands of years, long before the first European set foot on the region. So let us reclaim what it means to be Southeast Asian beyond the divisions and definitions imposed by Western imperialism on our people. Let us once again stand in solidarity and show the rest of the world the collective strength and resilience of Southeast Asia and its people, our people. So if you want to learn more about Southeast Asia, its people, its culture, and its history, check out the video description below for some useful links. Or you can also join us in our Demystifying Southeast Asia workshop series. Next week is part 2 of Demystifying the Philippines, from US occupation to the present-day nation-state of the Philippines. And the week after that is Demystifying the Vietnam War. And for the many ways you can effectively help the people of Nepal affected by the recent earthquake, there will also be links in the video description below. And I guess that's it for me today. And until next time, bye!
Most of the Filipinos who volunteered and were sent to serve in Vietnam did their duty with honor and dignity, and they achieved excellent results. The United States thanks the honor of Philippine veterans who served in Vietnam. Operation Brotherhood. In 1954, after the Vietnam had been divided into the Communist North and the non-Communist in the South, thousands of Northern Vietnamese fled south. Oscar Orlando, the president of Manila chapter of the Philippines Junior Chamber of Commerce, or the JCs, saw it as a humanitarian crisis and enlisted the support of the Philippine President Ramon Magsaysay, who responded thus: "We have been assigned in our hour of need by generous friends. Shall we then deny our help to neighborhoods when they are in need of it? Human misery knows no national boundaries. By all means, help them. And if there's anything I and the government can do to help, please feel free to come to me." Over the next 2 years, in what Filipinos designed Operation Brotherhood, the JCs, with the cooperation of the Philippine government, sent 235 doctors and nurses, social workers, dentists, and other workers, and treated some 730,000 patients in medical facilities throughout the South Vietnam. Philippines Civic Action Group Vietnam. In 1966, the Vietnamese government requested increased aid from the Philippines, including combat troops. In response, the Philippines sent a new detachment to the South Vietnam to replace PhilCon. The Philippines Civic Action Group Vietnam included an engineer construction battalion, medical and rural community development teams, and a security battalion in the logistic and headquarters element they set up based in Tha Ninh, 45 miles northwest in the Saigon. In the summer of 1966, over the next 40 months, performed a variety of civic action tasks, primarily in public works, construction, rural development, food, and medical relief. Air and naval bases. Perhaps the greatest contribution by the Philippine government to the U.S. effort in Vietnam was willingness to allow U.S. forces to continue operations out of naval bases Subic Bay, in the symbols of Clark Air Base in Angeles City in Luzon, both in the Philippines. Next, we're going to talk about the end of the Cold War. The Philippines got help by the United States, and they built roads and bridges by the U.S. Army and engineers. Next is the anti-Americanism entered to the Philippine political discourse. The major issues involved seem to have been the military bases. The bases were an important contribution to the Philippines' economy, but apparently offended Filipino political sensible. The United States formally recognized full Philippine sovereignty over the base in 1956. The tensions with the United States continued until some of the bases were dismantled and the lease period reduced in 1959. The United States, for its part, rejected Philippine financial claims and proposed prior to 1970s, the Philippines government maintained a close relationship with the Kuomintang-ruled Taiwan Republic of China and saw China, People's Republic of China, as a security threat. It began considering normalizing relations with the China at the start of 1970s, and these two countries established diplomatic relations on 9 June 1975 with the signing of the joint by the leaders of the two countries. Over the 34 years, China and the Philippines' relations in the general have attained a smooth development and also remarkable achievements in all areas. Bilateral cooperation. Since the establishment of the diplomatic relations, there has been frequent exchange of high-level visits between China and the Philippines. Since Song Dynasty times in China and the pre-colonial time in the Philippines, evidence of the trade contact can already be observed in Chinese ceramics found in archaeologist sites like in Santa Ana, Manila. During Ming and Qing dynasty times in China and Spanish colonial era in the Philippines, the Philippines through Manila has had centuries-long trade contacts in cities such as Guangzhou, Sangzhou, Xiamen, and Fujian province, in Guangzhou and in Macau, in Guodong, especially as part of the maritime Silk Road trade, then connected with the Manila galleon trade and ensured the export of the Chinese trade goods, such as China ware, across Spanish America and in Europe. Next, we're going to discuss about the cultural influence by the Britain and America. The video showing the native perspective throughout the Britain and American influences.
The Americans came over at the turn of the century, 1898. And then they finally annexed the Philippines. Okay. In the end, they took away choices from us, from the Filipinos. Schools, what do you learn? What books do you read? the medium of instruction.
All English, all American.
All John. Okay.
Oo.
And that's part of the process of the Americanization of the Filipino. So in that sense, imperialism yun and neocolonialism yun.
Oo.
No?
kasabay